Now we're on to arbor disassembly. The first thing I'm trying to do is brace this pulley so it doesn't spin when I'm trying to remove the nut on one end. The older Unisaw arbors did not have flats behind the arbor flange, and so you needed to find a creative way to brace it. So what I've found is if I put a Allen wrench in the set screw hole and turn the wrench on the machine thread end of the arbor, then the set screw Allen wrench gets caught on the pulley in the arbor bracket and it holds it, while then the ratchet can loosen the nut on that end. And then there's a keyed washer behind that nut, and there's a spanner nut as well that holds the bearing in the proper place. And so I'm working on those two things here, getting the keyed washer. The key goes in the keyway of the shaft on the arbor. So I'm working on those two things right now, trying to get a screwdriver behind the keyed washer to get that off. Working little by little around and trying not to bend that washer so I can reuse it. And then I'll work on the spanner nut. You can get a spanner nut tool. I think it's called a spanner wrench. But if you're careful with the flat slotted screwdriver, you can get the spanner nuts off without doing any damage to them. Just be careful. Don't hammer too hard on the little slots. Okay, so now I've got two screwdrivers to get this keyed washer out. So that's out. And now I'll work on the spanner nut. And again, I'm trying to I'm cleaning away some grime first to make sure that the everything's loose and ready to go. A lot of grime builds up on here. And now I've got the screwdriver in the little slot in the spanner nut, and little by little, carefully, and then I can just get it with my hands and get that off. And now that part's done. I'm taking the blade flange and blade nut off there. And now I'm just checking for the set screw. And if you can't get the Allen wrench started, just put a crescent wrench on the end of it, and then it comes right out. So we'll get that out. And then obviously that will allow the pulley to move on that shaft when we start trying to get the arbor out of this bracket. So I'm using a wooden dowel and a hammer to try to hammer that through. Do not hammer with a metal hammer on the end of that shaft. You will mushroom the shaft and ruin those machined threads. Try with the dowel first, and it may not budge depending on how long it's been sitting, but then you can use some penetrating oil in the set screw hole from the pulley, and little by little, patience and sorry, I'm in the way there. But basically, I kept pounding the dowel and the hammer, and eventually the arbor came free. And you can see I've almost got it all the way through. And I've got my hand on the other end so it doesn't drop onto the floor and ruin some of the threads. So the arbor is free, the pulley's free. Now I'm just trying to keep everything in order with the spacers. Okay, so now you can see the arbor assembly is taken out of the arbor bracket. Process went pretty well. Main thing now is to keep everything in order, take stock of what we've got. Don't want to put them back on in the wrong order. So in this case, this is an older arbor bracket, and so there's extended race bearings, and then there's a spacer, spring washer, pulley, spacer, and then on the other end of the arbor you can see the bearing. It's captured here, and this also is an extended race bearing. Now we'll carefully remove this one. I've made some mistakes on this before. If you don't have this braced properly in the vise, this part right here can snap. I've done that before. So do this carefully, vise properly. I'll get that bearing out and order new bearings, and then the reassembly will go from there. Obviously on this one I'll need to use a bearing puller to get this bearing off. But it's coming together pretty good. Now I'm working on what I just said in the narrated video there. I'm working on getting this bearing out of the arbor bracket carefully. with a dowel again and a hammer. Don't do metal on metal. Now I'm cleaning out the machined areas for where those arbors sit, so they sit smoothly. And I was trying to get that bearing off with bearing pullers, but it was extremely difficult, and ended up having to cut it off with an angle grinder. That's the first time I had to do that. Arbor and arbor bracket is all disassembled. Basically, as the video showed, you start by removing the spanner nut and the nut that's on this end. This is normally threaded, machine thread, very fine threads. You need to be very careful with these threads as you remove everything. I've done many of these arbors where these are pretty much stripped, and at that point you either need to try to chase the threads or buy a new arbor. And then the bearing, spacer, pulley, spacer, thrust washer or spring washer, and then bearing, and all that is captured in the arbor bracket here. Once you get this nut removed, then you can pound the arbor out, as I did, and then that leaves the bearing here. This bearing, you need to use bearing pullers to remove. This one was very difficult. I've had different challenges with this on the many arbors that I've rebuilt. This one was so challenging that the bearing actually cracked on the exterior. Sorry, I can't get a good shot of that. But the exterior of the bearing cracked, leaving only this interior piece on the arbor shaft. So that created a huge challenge to get off. Eventually I was able to get it to move a little bit with some vice grips and move up the shaft, and then eventually I actually had to take the angle grinder and very carefully cut through this, and I lined it up with the keyway, the angle grinder up with the keyway, so that if I went through too quickly I wouldn't nick the shaft, it would just go into the keyway. So then I was able to get that the rest of the way off because I cut this. So that was something that never happened before. Each one of these is different. You never know how it's been maintained, or if they're original bearings from 50 years ago, or if people have redone it and not done it right. So you just need to be willing to take what you get and do the best you can, and be creative on getting things removed. You see here I had bearing pullers ready and everything, but in this case that didn't even do it. Had to figure something else out. But now that it's all apart, it should be self-explanatory now. The bearings on this one are the extended race bearings. This was what they used on the older Unisaws. And so I'll get the right parts, put it all back together. On this arbor bracket, the teeth look great. There's no wearing on the teeth, so that's a good sign. And so that's all set.